All right. So welcome. Hi, Mine. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I'm really excited about talking about this particular topic because April is still Stress Awareness Month, which happens to be one of my favorite topics. And so I am going to talk about this kind of overview of what I've been sharing the last couple of weeks with you all and just kind of go through different stressors that can exist on different levels of this model, and then different strategies that can technically help either reduce some of the symptoms that relate to it or help with the management of the symptoms. Or even just help with in prevention or recovery. And so recognizing that, stress is, I mean, we live in very stressful times right now too. And so I thought, given that it is Stress Awareness Month, that it might be helpful to kind of talk a little bit more about, what are some tangible things that you could do on these different levels from a holistic perspective that could be helpful, and oftentimes I know that people, when we talk about stress, they're like, oh yeah, go do yoga, go do this, and sometimes it's not just about something that you do, this is really about looking at um, things that you can start putting in place to actually prevent stress from building too. And in 2 weeks, when when the next show is, I'm going to talk about stress recovery because we don't hear too much about stress recovery. And within the stress response, that recovery um, uh, period is really important in order to prevent a lot of the impact of the stress response from a physical perspective or from a physical manifestation, emotionally, cognitively, whatever. And so I'm going to focus a little bit more on stress recovery and really talk a little bit more about what that is and, what you can do to help yourself build some resilience with that, because a lot of people are not aware. I mean, when I talk about stress recovery and the period of it with people and working with people with their stress management or just kind of designing a different plan or a life for themselves, that when we talk about stress recovery, that's not a term that's come up. So I thought maybe, let's talk about it. So we're gonna kind of tackle that next in 2 weeks. So let's start with some basic definitions, and kind of look at what I'm going to cover here. And so obviously stress, I've talked about this before, and adaptation, adjustment, accommodation. And stress is really this kind of notion about how our body physically adapts, adjusts, accommodates to a perception. So keep in mind, this is also a perception of a threat. And it can be a real threat too. I'm not saying that it's only, a perceived threat. And this is not saying that it's all in your head. Okay. So there's a very distinct difference between perception and, stuff you make up, so to speak. Perception is something that has so many different variables and influences how we see things. That is what perception really is. And so one person can perceive like a work deadline as being the same kind of stress as like having a saber-toothed tiger in front of them, and another person sees it as being like a mouse in front of them, unless you're afraid of a mouse. I don't know, but maybe you understand what I'm saying. So hopefully you understand what I'm saying there. The perception of it is going to be very different, and so the impact of that perception is going to be different on the individual themselves. So when we're looking at this stress, we're really looking at what is the demand or the pressure, whether it's a real, concrete, physical, in reality thing that's happening, someone's threatening your life, you're witnessing something that, where you're perceiving that your safety, your security is being threatened. Those are very real things that happen. Or is it this, perception of a work deadline that might be, perceived differently based on individual characteristics? And so the body is adapting, adjusting, and accommodating to both internal and external pressures and demands. Prevention, oh, I'm not sure what this is. Uh-oh, I think I have the wrong one here. All right, well, anyway, so we're going to skip this, but prevention, management, reduction, and recovery. Those are the things that we're going to talk about with this model. All right, so this is the holistic model of stress. And what it does is it really kind of incorporates Western and Eastern approaches to understanding, how things can be working together and understanding how things from an evidence-based practice approach, and then also from an energy perspective, what it may look like for people. Because a lot of times, when I work with individuals, people don't always like the kind of some of the techniques or strategies that they've been exposed to or whatnot might seem very evasive or invasive, and take a lot of time, and it's not something that they feel prepared to do. And so introducing perhaps a different system sometimes is more effective with them. And so integrating the two can be helpful. So these are like the different examples of stressors that exist for the different levels. And I'm going to talk about what each level signifies, because when you look at it from a chakra perspective, which is what these levels are about, and then the corresponding kind of significance of the human experience, there's a lot of parallels that exist where we can also see kind of how stress manifests because of these different perceptions of, pressure or real threats or demands that are being placed on us. So the first one, level one is the brain and the root. And I talked about this, maybe like 2 episodes ago, and talked about how, this is basically the stress response itself. Like, this is what happens in the brain when the perception of a stressor is present. People that have trauma that's been unresolved or not healed, experience this. And, so the brain is impacted by stress because the neuronal pathways in the brain start to wire differently and start to impact the rest of the organism. So the human body, the way the thoughts are organized, emotions, how they may be elicited. A lot of research indicates, for people that experience a lot of trauma, especially in childhood, that sometimes what happens for individuals is that their limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain, doesn't have the same opportunity to fully develop and be able to manifest organically. So it kind of like bypasses. And so what that means for individuals is that they don't have, from a brain perspective, their brain does not have the same kind of emotional capacity as someone who did not experience trauma. They have to learn skills differently and later down the line because they had not learned those skills. And so a lot of people tend then to blame themselves that they don't know how to handle certain emotions or whatever. And the idea is that, well, it's because, one, when you experience a lot of trauma, one, the brain is not developing organically as it would without the trauma. And two, if there aren't people around that are helping you process through that, or you're getting help, a chance to heal from that, the brain is going to do what it needs to do in order to try to maneuver with that. So lack of primary needs, real and perceived demands and threats. And then you have the emotional level, which is level 2. This is the sacral chakra. And this is like unresolved past issues. Now, the corresponding, the chakra is really about the experience of joy. And so if you think about that, from an emotional perspective, all of us, as human beings, that's one of the most primary emotions that we want to experience is this kind of, you know, uh, different intensity of joy and have this kind of life that feels comfortable and with ease. And so what tends to happen in this level is that unresolved past issues, attachment, different associations, not having skills, perhaps not knowing what emotions are, not being validated for your experience and being able to have a safe place to express that. Those are all things that can be stressors in this level. You have the level 3, which are thoughts, and the corresponding chakra level is the solar plexus. And so this is really about a person's personal power and also their ability to have self-esteem. This is about their ability to set goals and be able to achieve them. And so when we think about this, corresponding with how our mind works, oftentimes a lot of people talk about how they have all these different thoughts in their mind. There's constant mind chatter. And we are all conditioned to a certain degree about things that we can do and can't do. And also like different things that we pick up, whether it be in our family of origin, whether it be in the peer circles that we grew up in this community that we live in the neighborhood that we grew up in society. We have these conditions that stay in our mind, things that we should and should not do. And oftentimes what happens is that these can manifest as patterns of thought that really interfere or cause stress because they become demands or pressure points for us that manifest that way. And then you have level 4, and this is the heart chakra and corresponds to physiological sensations. So this is very different than a physical experience. Physiological sensations are like the sensation like you notice a tingling or you experience, heat in your hands. That's a physiological sensation. So it's not like you have this experience of it could be fatigue even, like I feel tired. That's a physiological sensation. It's very different than a physical experience of level 1, which is like your entire system. And what's interesting with this particular level, so this is physical, emotional, information, these physical sensations that we experience have a lot more information than most people are aware of. When I was going through my doctoral training, this was one of the things that I was very interested in because, what I talked about in the last podcast was about how there are different ways of knowing things. And this is one way that's different of knowing things. Physiological sensations sometimes gives us information that we often don't pay attention to. Like, for example, when you think about the cue of hunger, that's a physiological sensation that tells you you're hungry. And so we oftentimes, people might ignore it, or they might be like, okay, I'm going to just pay attention to it later. I can't eat right now. And yet at the same time, it's an experience that is going to contribute and impact that stress level because it's a basic physiological need. And so the idea with it is recognizing that when these physiological sensations are present, it's really about kind of clearing that space. The heart chakra is about love, compassion, forgiveness. And with the heart chakra, this is where it kind of connects it's a connector, like a bridge to the higher chakras of level 5, 6, and 7. And the lower chakras are level 1, 2, and 3. So when you think about it, it's like level 1, 2, and 3 are really about the self, my survival, who I am as an individual, as a person. Are people going to see me? How do I exist? Things like that. And then when these things are not cleared, So, you see how like there's this trauma, there's these unresolved issues, there's all this mind stuff going on. All of that is going to influence the heart chakra. And so if the heart chakra is not clear, it subsequently influences levels 5 and 6, which is how it manifests in the world. So our behaviors, our environment, our values, our aspirations, things of that nature. And what I really like about, one of the things that I'm always drawn to with level 4 with the heart chakra is that Anahata is the name. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. But the translation of that is unstruck. So it's kind of like this very clear slate, quote unquote, so to speak, that it's not impacted by an experience of being hurt. There's like a clear perception. You're starting fresh, which is what reminds me of the color green. It's like spring. It's like, oh, everything's fresh. Everything's starting over kind of a thing. And then you have level 5, which is behavior environment. So this is like the throat chakra, which is communication. It's also how we express ourselves. Stressors that exist in this is job, money, support, our environment, our living environment, the environment around us, people that we associate with, things like that. And then level 6, I kind of already talked about. So level 1 and level 6, I'm not going to go over in detail because I've already kind of covered that, but I do want to kind of talk about these other levels and give some ideas about what are some strategies that can help manage and reduce some of the stress that a person may be experiencing to help the impact of that experience. So this is what we covered, or what I covered when I talked about level 1 a few weeks ago. And then, so this is level 2. Again, this is the emotion. Again, this is like, recognizing that there is this sense of joy that exists with the level 2 chakra, the sacral chakra. But it's also about just emotions in general. And, this is the creativity that people experience, the emotional well-being, the ability to kind of take risks and be able to defend oneself. And so some of the things that can be very helpful in this level, from an emotional perspective, fasting is one. And I'm not talking about like food fasting. I'm talking about like fasting from TV, fasting from the news, fasting from social media, toxicity. Because if you think about it, like toxicity really does, minimize joy, right? It's very hard to experience joy when there's negativity. And the more negativity and more negative energy that you have present around you, it's very challenging to experience that positiveness and that kind of sense of cultivating joy that you want to experience. And so the idea with fasting is being able to minimize as much as possible. And again, that's going to vary per person. I know like with clients that I work with, I sometimes give them the homework assignment, for 1 week, just don't watch this or don't do this. Let's see what happens. And I mean, I don't tell them not to do, I just want to make that clear. We kind of talk about it as a suggestion. And then if they're on board with it, we look at the parameters of it for them, what's going to work for them. And then talk about it in the next session and see what happens. And most of the time, they have developed some awareness about how it has impacted them when they don't engage so much in these things. Journaling is another thing, getting it out, writing it down. There's a lot of research out there that talks about how, like, and this is actually like physically writing something. Is the research that I'm referencing. Penn Baker, I believe, is the name. I know I'm mispronouncing it. But there was a lot of research that he did back in the 80s about having people write out trauma, like a traumatic experience that they had. And he had them write this out in one study that he had, that he would have them write this out for, I think it was 3 days, for like 15 minutes. And it actually impacted the experience that they had of this trauma. It helped in the healing of it. And so from the research that he did, because he, repeated the experiment, and there's been other studies that have been done after that. The idea with it is that there's this connection with the physical act of writing and with the brain and with actually getting the emotion on paper. And so it really is about just putting down whatever is going on for you. It's not about censoring it. And journaling is different than venting. It's different than just, getting it out of your system kind of a thing, because journaling is really about reflection too. Writing it like a wave when you're experiencing an emotion, this is really just kind of paying attention to what's going on and kind of surfacing it. Emotions are very fluid, and the sacral chakra is fluidity. That's part of what the chakra is about, is recognizing that it's not absolute. And so things do ebb and flow. And many of you have probably experienced this yourself, when your emotions are very, very high intense some days, and then, you give it some time and you notice that it kind of decreases in intensity. That's kind of like that wave. It just kind of ebbs and flows. And so riding it like a surfer, tends to be one way of being able to help reduce some of the impact of it. Dr. Kristen Neff is a psychologist, and she did a lot of research on self-compassion. And the three things that she, talks about as being a component of self-compassion is kindness, being kind to yourself, like thinking about how you're compassionate to other people when they're going through a hard time and suffering. You're kind to them. And you recognize that they're going through a hard time. And her research has focused on how that's the same kind of kindness that we give to ourselves. This is hard. I'm going through a lot. There's a lot going on. And it's okay for me to feel this way right now. It's okay that I'm struggling. It's okay that, I may not do everything on my to-do list or whatever the case may be. And this arose out of her own personal experiences. Where she was recognizing that she was struggling one day, and became mindful of the experience, and then recognized how it had a very different shift for her. And that's what got her into kind of researching what this was about, what happened for her. And so the second one is universality, recognizing common humanity, that as a human being, we all go through this. Suffering is it's common. Like, you are not alone in this, that pretty much anyone in your situation is going to experience some level of what you're experiencing. And many of you, have probably shared that with friends, that are going through a hard time. Yeah, that is hard. I know I would experience something like you are, or, I know someone else that is experiencing that. And then being mindful of it, staying present with it. And then hugs, is another one to help with this emotional space. Touch, your skin is the biggest organ. And so touch and hugs, a pet or a person, this is consensual touch, consensual and invited, not non-consensual. But touch and connection, it does help release oxytocin, which does help minimize the impact of the stress response. This is why a lot of times it's released more in women than it is in men. There is a biological difference in the brain, but this is why, like, there's this saying in some of the research that they talk about how with women, women tend to tend and befriend. So when they're going through stress, they go to girlfriends or, friends or a support group or something to connect with people, because that's part of this chemical release. And so some of the research that's being done or has been done is demonstrating how that can happen for men and other individuals as well, that may not have this chemical release in the same kind of intensity level. So that's that section. So we have now the, oh, did someone want to say something? All right. So this is the solar plexus. So this is the third chakra. This relates to your thoughts. This is also about, the ability to set goals, your self-esteem, your personal power. And so if you think about it, really recognizing how personal power is very much tied into our thoughts too. We are constantly thinking. We have 65 to 80,000 thoughts a day, conscious and unconscious, subconscious thoughts, right? We're constantly thinking. And so what some research has demonstrated, and they did this by electromagnetic impulses or electro something impulses, like little nodes that were connected to the brain, and they looked at impulses with thoughts that were going on, is that this is how they found out how many thoughts were happening, being fired, okay? And so the idea with it is that if you're thinking about, okay, 65 to 80,000 thoughts a day, and roughly, more than half of these thoughts might be negative. So you're talking subconscious thoughts, conscious thoughts, things you're aware of, things you're not aware of are negative. That's going to impact your stress response and your ability to handle stress, your ability to manage stress, your ability to believe that you can manage and handle stress. And so the idea with this is that personal power then becomes compromised. Well, I cannot handle this. This is not something I can do. And so it then has this kind of loop effect. And so, cultivating awareness of what you're actually thinking, we call this metacognition, thinking about what you're thinking, so to speak. That's what mindfulness is. You're not actually thinking about it, you're just aware of it. But metacognition is that you're thinking about what you're thinking. So what am I actually thinking? Where is that coming from? Knots are something that, kind of looking at the knots that are knotting you up. That's kind of the little twist I gave to it. Little kind of a, I know, corny joke, I know, but whatever. So anyways, what knots are binding you? I cannot do this. I should not do this. I will not. Somebody tells me they won't do this. So these are known as kind of like cognitive distortions. In cognitive psychology, this is huge. There's like 20 different patterns that exist. And so we look at, okay, what are some of these kind of primary patterns that may exist for you? Because what research has demonstrated, and this is an evidence-based practice, is that different patterns of distortions do contribute to depression, anxiety, and stress. So I'm just going to finish the thoughts because I know we're running out of time. And then when we meet back in 2 weeks, I'll finish this up and talk about stress recovery. But R&R is reflect and reassess. And so this is really just kind of about recognizing that with the thoughts is looking at what am I thinking and reassessing the situation. So it's kind of like problem solving in a way. And then affirmations, statements of what you want as if you already have them. Affirmations are really a way of kind of convicting yourself. You are convicting yourself, convicting yourself of a belief. I want to be convinced of this. And so when you repeatedly say a phrase that you want to have present in your life, the idea with that is that it ties those neuronal pathways in your brain so that it starts developing that pathway in your brain and it becomes more habitual. Instead of it being more effortful, it becomes less effortful. And then the narrative, which is, what is your stress story? The story is reinforced and affects the other system. So really looking at how you talk about and narrate your experience of stress, because a lot of that is going to have to do with personal power, with goals, with your thoughts. And so really looking at how do I present my story to people? How am I telling myself my story? And what can I do to kind of change that? And so this is really more of kind of like a prevention strategy too, because once you kind of look at your own narrative and you can shift that, it's a way to actually help prevent stress from becoming larger down the road too. So not just in the moment, but down the road. It helps to kind of shift all of that. So that's kind of, the other two different levels. I don't know if anybody wants to say something about that. I apologize for running over. I get so excited about sharing this information, but what are people's thoughts related to that? That's a lot of information, I know. I just love dumping information on people. All right. Well, so in 2 weeks, I will talk about level 4 and level 5, and then talk about stress recovery, because that is a really important part to pay attention to when we talk about managing stress. And again, if you have any questions, or if you want more information, there's lots of resources on my website as well, and I'm always open to sharing that. All right. Thanks for being here, everyone. Have a good
Thank
rest of your night. All right. Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.